You're welcome back. This is Newsfile. It's your most authoritative news analysis platform, and I'm your host, Samson Ladi Anyanini. And just gone by was Samson's Take, and I titled it, Let's Remember June 3. And on June 3, the graphic report was captioned, Apocalypse in Accra, 150 dead so far in flood inferno. And up to this point, there are many of them that are still struggling with life, some that are still not knowing what will happen to them, whether they will survive it or not. There are some that have suffered permanent disfigurement of their entire bodies, as you saw, apart from those you saw being thrown into the buckets of the vehicle because they were dead, charred bodies. There are those who suffered permanent disfigurements of their faces, fractured legs and arms, permanent disfigurements of their torsos, arms, stomachs, legs, chest, backside, and doctors' reports say some of them will never get back to their original place. But guess what? It took some other country to give Ghana some small amount of money, which we have given to some of them in 5,000, 8,000, and 10,000, and that has been the end of it. Our government and our state is waiting for them to get a judgment in a court to compel it to take care of these people. My guest on Newsfile this morning, Dr. Kwabena Bempatando, Deputy Director General for Quality and Access of the Ghana Education Service. Thank you very much for making time to join us, sir.
It's a pleasure this morning to see you.
Also, Bright Simmons, Honorary Executive, Imani Africa. Thanks for joining us, Bright.
Thank you for having me.
On Zoom is Kofi Abotsi, Dean, UPSA Law School. Mr. Kofi Abotsi, thank you for joining us. All right. So as you know, we have two issues that we are looking at. We are looking at the eased restrictions and why there seem to be, quote unquote, rejection of what appeared to have been expected. A greater majority of the churches are not going to church tomorrow, even though the president said go to church. And some of them had actually asked for it. So what's going on? And the schools too, are they actually getting back in full? And how are people protected? So we'll focus more particularly on the two aspects as to the schools and the churches. And then we'll go to deal with the unending, disputes, if you like, about the new voters register. So we first can hear the president on Sunday telling us what the new regime in these COVID times are.
Fellow Ghanaians, with effect from Friday, 5th June, we will begin stage 1 of the process of easing restrictions. An abridged format for religious services can commence. 25% attendance with a maximum number of 100 congregants can worship at a time in church or at the mosque, with a mandatory 1 meter rule of social distancing between congregants. In addition to the mandatory wearing of masks for all persons at all times in churches and mosques, a register of names and contact details of all worshippers and hand-washing facilities and sanitizers must be provided, with a maximum duration of 1 hour for each service. Religious institutions that are desirous of opening their premises to their members, such as churches, mosques, and others, must disinfect, fumigate, and put in place the requisite logistics needed to guarantee safe opening and operationing. They must work with the designated regulatory bodies and undertake test runs of the protocols I have outlined. I would appeal to them, in the case of Christians, on the first Sunday of reopening, i.e. 7th June. In the case of the Adventists, Saturday, 6th June. And in the case of Muslims, on the first Friday, i.e. Salat al-Jum'ah, on 5th June, to dedicate their worship to prayers for the nation in these challenging times. The Minister for Religious Affairs will tomorrow, Monday, 1st June, outline in detail the specific guidelines for the safe reopening of our churches and mosques.
Right. So we already know the posture of the churches or the religious organizations to the opportunity that the president gave them upon the advice that he has had from the medical or physicians who are also helping in the COVID-19 situation. For most of the churches, we know now, they are simply not responding, and they have chosen to rather wait, including ICGC, which originally cautioned those pastors who were asking for the situation to be opened up. For the Catholic Church, very massive religious organization in the country, they appear to say that the various bishops and pastors within the various places must assess their own circumstance and determine whether they are ready to proceed with church or masses, except that they will not be able to comply with all the measures that are suggested, including how to deal with communion. Let me begin with Bright. Was it your expectation, although there are some people who predicted that this will happen and got invited by the police for predicting the president so accurately?
In terms of reopening, or
yes,
the phase reopening?
Yes.
It's becoming clear that the anchors of policy, the triggers for specific decisions are not very clear. So we don't know, for instance, whether we're looking at a particular infectivity ratio or we are looking at a particular rate of rise or a particular transmission dynamic. So it has become obvious that the interminable postponements were no longer tenable, because it's not clear at what stage you start to loosen up restrictions. And you couldn't really communicate to people what the yardsticks for those decisions would be. So it's become quite apparent for a while now that we're relying largely on gut instinct. They're looking at some data, they are listening to people, and based on the general mood in the committees, the technical committees and the likes that are advising the government, they've decided to start taking some actions largely on faith.
Right.
Because it's quite clear, if you take the infections that we've recorded this week, it's about 5 times the infections that were recorded in the whole first month after the first infections were detected. So there is no evidence whatsoever that the restrictions that have been used so far are having the effect that they should have. And I had a sense that it gets to a point where if it is not too clear what is driving the decision making, then discretion, judgment, political instinct, those kind of things become much more predominant. So I wasn't too surprised, because it wasn't clear to me anymore what the triggers for government decision making were.
All right.
Well,
we'll be concentrating on you a lot, because you are going to superintend, or as you are superintending, the opening of the schools in the phased manner that the president has announced. The reaction first of the religious organizations.
Thank you. I came here to talk about schools.
Right.
But I would like to say that, unfortunately, for someone who is a big believer in data and the interpretation of data in decision making, your assertion is a bit worrying. Because from the very beginning, His Excellency the President has made every decision based on data. And he has informed the Republic and everybody in this country that his decisions are made on science, the science of the disease, as well as the data that is available. And it is based on that, at least on the education side, we have made every decision. I have been fortunate enough to at least sit in 3 or 4 meetings with the president's COVID team. And as someone who really believes and understands the interpretation of data, every decision that the president, His Excellency Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo, has made has been based on the evidence of science and the evidence of data. So the assertion that it is gaffe instance simply implies that, you know, the understanding of the data has not been clear, at least to you, and you need to be able to look at really the evidence. To say that the rates have increased in the past week than it was in the first couple of weeks simply also means that there is more testing today than there was 8-10 weeks ago. So the rate of testing obviously will mean when you are searching for the disease, you are more likely to find more. But what we need to look at is the totality of the data. While I am not a health expert, I am at least a scientist when it comes to data analysis. And so if you look at the number of cases, and then you look at the number of recoveries, and most importantly, if you look at the deaths and the fact that most of the deaths have been also attached to comorbidity, then you need to be able to at least look carefully and interpret that data effectively.
What do you make?
Because
yes, quickly.
Yeah. So no, well, it's not, almost everything he said is absolutely incorrect. One, the point that was just made regarding the time span involved, for instance, was completely adverse to what the facts show. What the facts show is that even though we raised testing right after lockdown, the number of tests being conducted recently are fewer. The number of tests being conducted are fewer than what it was during Ramadan. So we've gone from something like 12,000 tests a day at the peak of that action to something in the region of about 3,000 a day. So I can't understand how you could say that the number of tests have risen and therefore infection detection has risen. We also know the positivity rate. When you do a specific subset of tests, you know how many of them are testing positive. We know that has also risen. We also know that there's an upward trend in active cases, etc. So I don't understand when he says that. I mean, he's making conclusive statements that are not, in alignment with the data.
Right. Now, I'm surprised about that.
Unfortunately, that would be his position, but the data...
No, that's
but the matter he raises about the number of tests, I suppose you will agree that you got that wrong.
No, I didn't get that wrong.
We have not increased our testing.
At no point have we tested. You can go to Noguchi and look at it. 12,000 people per day. You know, in the whole testing regime that we've had, we've only have about 220 or 230,000 tests. So at no point during the lockdown, if we're doing 12,000 a day over a 21
that was statements that were made by the scientists themselves, that they had risen, their capacity had risen to that level.
I would like you to look at the evidence of the statements. I think that we need to be very careful because we're also communicating to the Ghanaian people. And so
what was the test right after lockdown? What is the test now?
The government never said that they were doing 12,000 a day. At the maximum, it was about 5,000 or 6,000 during the tracing time. You know, so I think that the main thing is we need to understand data.
So have the number of tests gone down or not?
The number of tests is based on contact tracing.
No, has it gone down or not? That is fact.
This is just...
No, the fact is that you test based on contact tracing.
No. So let's answer the specific question. No, let's answer the specific question, which has generated this controversy now.
But
his point is that the number of tests has gone down than it was at the time we're seeking to ramp up.
The number of tests, yes. You see, that question, it's not an absolute answer question. Your number of tests is determined by the cases that you are identifying. So if this week I have identified 10 people that I'm doing contact tracing for, then those 10 people's contact tracing may give me, say, 200 or 250
I take it that you don't want to answer that.
No, it's because it's not a yes or no. The whole thing is
let me bring Mr. Abotsi in quickly on his view also of the reaction, particularly by religious organizations, and then we can move on to the schools. And I would like you also to look at the measures that religious organizations are supposed to take if they are congregating whether it is feasible at all. Hello, Mr. Abotsi.
Yes, good morning, Samson.
Good morning. You'll be attending Mass tomorrow?
No, I'm not.
Why? You're a Catholic. The Catholic Church says your church may be opened for Mass.
Yes, it is opened. It is a right that is left to me to exercise, and I have to exercise my right in the best possible, in a manner that best possibly safeguards not only my own interest, but advances the purpose for which I even visit the church in the first place. I think one reality is true, and that reality is the disease, as was discovered some months ago, hasn't changed in character. Things have not necessarily improved, even in other parts of the world. It may appear that we have been able to combat it to a point because of interventionist measures that were put in place, but the disease itself hasn't changed for us to change the circumstances for which the interventions were put in place. The relaxation is absolutely sensible, in my opinion, if you ask me. But the manner of implementing that relaxation is left to the individual churches and left to the individual entities that have the right to exercise. I do not think that. Hello?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, I do not think that as we speak, the churches have been able to put in place. And again, from everything we're hearing, it doesn't seem that the churches are in a position to implement that. But the president has done what I think is absolutely correct, i.e., leave the option to the churches subject to certain specific interventions that are supposed to be put in place. So some may be able to do that, others may not. But the option has been left to the churches and the rights exercisers. We are the right exercisers. So the option has been left to us to exercise those rights. The difficulty with that is clearly the fact that the churches in particular are not in the habit of turning people away. And so once you have a restricted number of people who can enter the church, you are essentially asking the churches to come out with standard criteria for determining who should come in and who should not once the number of a certain number is exceeded. And that's difficult because it's not something they've been used to doing. That is one difficulty. The second difficulty is, let's be honest, I'm not sure that the churches have been preparing for this, i.e. the interventions that need to be put in place. And so in light of that, if you ask me whether I'm going to church tomorrow, I think that's the reason I'm not, because I haven't received sufficient assurances of the requisite safeguards having been put in place that would guarantee my safety once I'm in church praying. And that's the reason I'm staying away. So it's a right I have to exercise. It's a right I can, but I won't.
Right. I've read, for example, the circular as issued by the priests, as in the Catholic Church, who have come together and decided what to do. And they say, for example, that first you must disinfect. After disinfection, you must put all the protocols in place. You must admit 100. The president says 100. Once you admit 100, you do only an hour, and then the directive about communion cannot be complied with, cannot be compromised, because that's such a sacred process in delivering the communion. You cannot say it should be put somewhere at the gate for some people to come pick it up. I know the other churches who are also fighting even the collection thing, that you put the collection bowl outside for people to put the collection in. Then after you are done with your hour, there's 1 hour time for another period of disinfection, so to speak. They may use alcohol rub to clean the places nicely for the next group to come in. If the next group finishes, you repeat the same thing. 1 hour period before the next group comes. There are no Sunday schools to be organized, so you go to church without your kids. You think this is practical?
We need to remember, first of all, that the presidential directives are made pursuant to an executive instrument. They are therefore legal directives. They have to be complied with in the manner in which the directives are issued. Now, the directives, as I understand them, are not issued in their alternative. They are issued as a cumulative set of directives, so they have to be complied with fully. So a church cannot say that I will open, I will disinfect, I will do one or two of the other directives, but for a particular one, I will not comply, or we will not comply.
No, if I may give a little clarity here, on the point of how to deliver communion, the understanding is that they have met with the minister, and it's been agreed that the manner in which the minister spoke about it is not practicable. It cannot be done. So that one has been compromised together with the minister's understanding. And your reference to EI, once again, the EI is not ready. The president spoke, but the EI is not ready.
Okay, so what it means is that by the time the EI comes out, it has to reflect what has been agreed. I'm just saying basically in the abstract that if those directives are issued and they are issued pursuant to the EI, we cannot cherry pick, or we cannot apply with them in a hanky-panky manner. But again, I understand all these things. Look, let's be real practical about this. There's a standard means by which the disease is transmitted. This has been agreed on and agreed to by the medical experts, and this is facts, or these are facts out there. We don't have to belabor the point. If therefore a particular mode of conducting religious services has the propensity to lead to the spread of the disease, I do not think it's a behavior that ordinarily should be condoned or accepted. And the nature of this disease, because it's a public health thing, it's not confined to a particular place. So one church's failure to comply, for example, the directives, leading to a spread of the disease, even in that church, is invariably endangering all of us because it's going to come out into the public space. So the point I was just trying to make in the end is these directives have been issued, if you like, as a compromise from the initial directives, which are totally restrictive of religious services. I think moving forward, the president has just recognized one reality, and that reality is this: the disease is going to be with us for some time to come. In light of the fact that the disease is going to be with us for some time to come, from all the prognosis of the medical experts, the WHO, etc., I think there has been the recognition that it's important to restore human rights and a sense of normality for some time. Now, in doing that, one has to be careful not to restore things to the status quo, given the fact that the disease is not gone away, and therefore we may end up completely just undoing everything that has been done so far. Point. So there has been a very graduated, phased approach to the restoration of normality.
All right.
Now, that is what I see or I sense is being done. But the difficulties are clearly some of the things you've mentioned, and the point I mentioned, that the churches are not in the habit of rationing the number of people who come to worship at a particular point in time. So this probably will be the very first time in their history they have to do this. I do not think that they have the mechanisms in place to achieve this. Secondly, the instructions that have been given in terms of the sanitation instructions, the sanitizing and the disinfections and all that. Again, I do not think that there are structured processes in place to ensure that each church is complying. The difficulty with all these is that we have thousands of churches out there, and we have even many more branches of these churches around the place. How do we police such a measure? And if we have mass infraction, which is likely again, how do we execute compliance? Right. Is compliance going to lead to arrests and people being forced into line to ensure that they comply with all this? So there are practical challenges in the way of implementing this, and I'm not sure if we've thought about all these from the various angles.
Okay, thank you very much. And Bright, the president also, thought about the possibility of us getting some spike once this is done. So he said there is a readiness. Once we discover that something has gone wrong, we will take the immediate steps to check it. So is the reason the people who come to the service, the 100 people, must put their names down. So in case anything happens, we can quickly contact trace. If a church is serious, or a mosque or any other religious organization is serious, they can comply with this very easily and go ahead with their worship, can't they? And we have seen some who are demonstrating. They have bought the temperature guns. They've done all the things. We have seen some of them simulating on television for us to see that it's possible.
Yes, I think one thing I definitely agree with Mr. Abotsi about is that we've come to the conclusion, all of us, that we don't have a silver bullet to this pandemic. And attempts to suppress it completely are not very realistic. So the measures are the best, they are satisfying measures. They are the best optimal measures available given the circumstances, which is to attempt somewhat to remove some of the repressions and some of the restrictions on people's rights, but not to make it unfettered. So I completely agree that these measures, in the way that they've been couched, are reasonable. Of course, the first attempt at formulating them has not met with, I'm not going to say approval, but certainly it has not met with the satisfaction of the religious leaders. And some of them have said that unless additional clarifications are done, they're not going to meet. But we do also have religious organizations in this country who've said that notwithstanding the civic measures, they intend as religious leaders to instruct their flocks to remain at home.
Yeah.
So that is also interesting.
They are in the majority.
But your specific question was about the management of the process. I think it's very much the case that what has to happen is that government has to try and spread out infections as much as it can. Whether or not that is working is where I disagree with my brother in the studio, in the sense that there isn't any modeling that I am privy to that suggests that the non-pharmaceutical interventions that are currently in place are having the effect of stretching. So we would need to see more efforts made at better understanding of the transmission dynamics. How disease is moving from one part to the other, where the hotspots are emerging and why. We will need at least a few published papers from the COVID-19 committee. Right. They don't have to be peer-reviewed papers. Right. But at the very least, some published papers that the rest of us, in some great detail, can begin to rely upon. The challenge we have now at present is that we don't have these papers. Nobody has published anything that says, here is what we've studied, here are the data. I've been looking at other countries, and the number of published white papers by government committees, scientific committees, it's unbelievable. I was just looking at the UK situation not too long ago. But take South Africa, which is much closer to us in terms of the circumstances. And they have had several published papers by their scientific committees telling you how the spread is happening and how they intend to stretch out the infectivity rate and the likes of it. So without that, I can only say, and I can only repeat, and this is not being derogatory, this is just being factual, that we are relying more on gut instinct, which in political management is allowed. You are allowed to use your instinct and your judgment. But that is what we're largely relying on. Right. I know for sure, speaking to health specialists in this country, that they have seen an increase in the burden at OPDs, which already are somewhat constrained, but also in admissions. One of the things that will happen is that we look at people in critical care and people with severe disease and then mortalities. We're not looking at people on admission in general. That information is not being provided. Right. So we are relying on our own surveys of medical practitioners in this country, and they are telling us that admissions are rising and people reporting with moderate illness is rising. We're not tracking those. So I think that we have to start increasing the range and the spectrum of policy tracking, outcomes tracking the outcomes, right. And some of these will require new indicators.
So I'm happy that my brother is coming around to the idea that it should be science, because the fact that he's now asking, just because you have not seen the data doesn't mean that the science is not there. So what he's asking
for saying that he should publish papers.
He's asking,
but that doesn't mean that.
So the idea is that he's coming around to the idea that let's look at the data.
So from Monday the 15th of June, the president says, with engagement of the teacher unions, whom he has enjoyed a lot of cooperation, schools are to begin to reopen to allow for final year, junior high and senior high and university students to resume classes ahead of the conduct of their respective exit examinations. Final year students are to report to the universities on the 15th of June. Final year senior high school SHS 3 students, together with SHS 2 gold track students, on the 22nd of June, and final year junior high school JHS 3 students on the 29th of June. JHS 3 classes will comprise a maximum of 30 students. SHS classes, a maximum of 25 students, and university lectures will take place with half the size, the class size. You think this is practical?
Yes, it's very practical, and this is an area where we've had a lot of consultations. It's not just the unions. The president mentioned the unions because, of course, they were a key factor in terms of the contribution to what needs to happen in terms of reopening. But we have consulted with CHAS, which are the Conference of Heads of Assisted Senior High Schools or Secondary Schools. We've consulted with COPS, which are the headmasters for basic schools. We've consulted with our regional directors of education, our district directors of education. We've consulted with our universities, vice chancellors, a lot of consultation. But in addition, there's been a lot of consultation with CSOs. We've worked very closely with GNEC as a body. We've worked with our development partners. And we have also looked at evidence in terms of what is happening elsewhere. And we all looked at the possibility that if you bring the final year students, which is the president's wise decision that let's bring the final year students because they have an exit exam to take. Let's look at the protocols that are in place. In Ghana, we say social distancing is 1 meter. And 1 meter for most of us is about an arm stretch. And that you look at the other...
1 meter when you're in the mask.
Yes,
okay.
Yeah, it's about an arm stretch. And then we look at the other things that must be in place, that these can be done. Based on that, we also then looked at the fact that we need to reduce our class sizes. So if you're only going to have your final year students in school, and even in the schools that run double track, your gold track Form 2 students, who were critical because they were about 6 weeks behind the green track, that if you have all those students in school, you have enough space to spread around. You know, let's, for example, take junior high schools. JHS1 and JHS2 are not in school. So even in schools that have, say, 70 or 80 students in a class, you split it 3 times and you have less than 30. But then splitting it 3 times will almost be like replicating JHS 1, 2, and 3. The teachers rotate just like they usually do, and they are able to teach all of the students. So those are the practical things.
That comes with the need for more supply of teachers to take care of them?
No, because JHS1 and JHS2 are not in school.
Okay.
Because in every junior high school, we have between 8 and 10 teachers based on the arrangement of the junior high school. And they usually teach 3 classes. Now you are asking JHS1 to not be in, JHS2 to not be in. So even if you split your JHS3 group into 3, it's like replicating JHS1, 2, and 3. Okay. So the same number of teachers can teach based on your timetable. So those are things that we've done the modeling, we've looked at the application, and we've looked at the sensibility. We've also worked very closely with WAEC because we needed to understand what modalities needed to be in place to make sure that the exams happen safely. We had to look at what was left in terms of academic work that needed to be done and what preparation students need to do to take the exams. So those things have been well thought through. Luckily for us, the Honorable Minister for Education had been working with us even before the President's announcement to begin to look at what are some of the things that we need to look at. And since the President's announcement, every decision that we have taken in Ghana Education Service, you know, has been to work on how do we live with what everybody calls the new normal, you know, and how do we ensure that this happens. And the President's decision that bring final year students to school in the 3 different levels and bring the gold track to school, that was even some of the suggestions that CHAS itself came up with. You know, the unions themselves came up with those suggestions. We looked at what else was working in other places.
So in the universities, they are supposed to do half the class size.
Yes.
But for JHS, it will have to be not more than 30 students.
Yes.
For SHS, it will be a maximum of 25 students.
Yes.
Why the differentiation to have half the class of a university situation where we know that the numbers are huge? You could have as many as upwards of 400 in one class.
Yes, but that also means that you have large lecture theaters as opposed to junior and senior high schools where you seem to have more of a classroom structure. And so, you know, the idea behind half the class in all levels is that you want to reduce the congestion in your classroom by 50%, you know, and the 30 in a junior high school where we were looking at the average number of students in a class, which was hovering between 55 and 65. So if you halve it, it's about 30. And then for senior high schools, on average, we have some that are a little higher, some that are way lower. But on average, you're looking at about 50 to 52 students.
And everybody will be supplied with masks, reusable.
Every student will be supplied with 3 reusable face masks, washable and reusable face masks. Every teacher and every non-teaching staff that must come to school will also be supplied with same 3 reusable face masks. Every single school, public and private, will be supplied with at least the minimum of what the scientists are saying is required. Hand washing facilities. So we're going to provide Veronica buckets for every school, whether they have sinks or not. We're going to provide water, even with schools that have difficulty in terms of access to water. Water will be supplied with coordination from district directors to the schools. Soap will be supplied to every single school. In addition, hand sanitizers for intermittent sanitization of your hands.
And they are not supposed to be breaks.
In our junior high schools, what we are saying is that they would only be in school for 4 hours a day. They will start at 9 and they'll complete at 1. This is because the health and well-being checks that need to happen. We are also supplying every school with temperature guns. So they need to take their time to do those health and well-being checks. Now, we know that we do not want large gatherings. And so they come to school for 4 hours, they do their 45-minute class, and then 15-minute break, more controlled in their class session. They do 4 sessions, by 1 o'clock they close, they go home. That's the junior high schools. Senior high schools, they stay a little longer, they're a bit more mature, but the day schools, they follow those same procedures, they go home.
All right.
The boarding schools, of course, because we're going to put them in the boarding facilities, then we have different arrangements. But in all of our schools, we are also identifying a space where you can do isolation of students should you see that the temperatures are going up or people are exhibiting certain symptoms. And we are providing training to our staff to be able to at least do those basic things. But more importantly, we are also doing the mapping of every single school in this country, which actually started under Dr. Nsiasare when he was Director General of the Ghana Health Service. Mapping of every single school to a health facility, whether public or private health facility, to make sure that each school has a health facility that can support them in this period. Of course, this is to ensure that the students who need to exit can exit. Otherwise, you'd have a bigger crisis on your hands, because in the next academic year, whenever that begins, you would have anywhere between 500,000 to 600,000 cohort of KG students who must come into school.
Right. Now, right, the same apprehension, perhaps, maybe I should say, or hesitation that you and other people would have about reopening the churches or religious, places of worship should be the same for the schools, isn't it? And you had mentioned, and the question came up, which we were dealing with. If you look at the Ghana Health Service data, you will see that even the positivity rate is also on the rise. It was 7 last week, and it's 7% last week, and it is 19 this week. The point, therefore, is we are at a higher risk then, are we not?
So, I mean, my good friend in the studio tends to say that we should take the assertions for fact. If you say that we are looking at data, then we are looking at data. If we say that we are following the science, then we are following the science. No, I don't think it works that way. I mean, I think the nature of accountability in political office is that you go out of your way to assure people that you are doing so by providing transparency. So if indeed you're working on models, publish them. Put them out, let people read them. I have been doing policy analysis in this country now for 15 years. I was just checking last time when I became an adjunct fellow at Imani, and I've seen governments come and go, and the one thing that the Ghanaian governments refuse to accept is that you need to be pinned down to commitments in writing. This thing where we do government by oral culture worry all of us, because it becomes very difficult to pin them to specific commitments. It becomes, oh, the minister said this on this radio station, and this other special assistant said this on this TV station. It's very difficult that way. So if you say you have models about how you're going to contain transmissions in school, publish them. Let me give you an example. Learning Policy Institute, Brooklyn's Institute, the Brooklyn Institution, and a number of other organizations have done comparative matrices across the world of how schools are reopening. So of the 194 countries where we had comprehensive school shutdowns, about 134 now are 134 are still shut. So we have almost 60. And Ghana tends to be on the, I would say, cutting edge when it comes to reopening and loosening restrictions, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It just shows that we have a bit more appetite for risk. And if it's informed risk, that's reasonable, right? The challenge that I have is that when I look at these other countries, South Korea, Taiwan, the UK, Denmark, etc., I've done a literature review, I have extensive bodies of evidence about exactly how particular decisions are taken to the exclusion of other decisions. So for instance, the so-called gold standard, which is the alternating streams model, I think I've seen Professor Kamesh done modeling around 2 weeks in, 2 weeks out, has now been fairly validated as the most robust. Though obviously you have to collect more data. But the assumption is that given the behavior of the disease, its gestation period, etc., 2 weeks alternating tends to be such that if there are symptoms, you are likely to catch enough of them in the house before they come back and infect. We are doing continuous streaming, so there's no alternating. If they go in 6 weeks, it's throughout, 6 weeks throughout. Well, you could have an argument about that, but I would like to see some published work that says, look, we looked at evidence in terms of the disease behavior in Ghana, and we are quite fine with the continuous stream. We don't want to do alternating, because actually when we look at our situation in Ghana, we think that will exacerbate the problem. I would like that. I would appreciate that. Unfortunately, the tendency tends to be that we should take people at their word, as opposed to showing us the analysis and the reasoning. The second thing that I've also discovered is not in the public information, that he may well say that they have that information, but we don't know about it, which is problematic. But one thing I've discovered...
But we also ought to know that the president said in due course, before the schools reopen, the education ministry will bring out the specific...
Yeah, but those are guidelines.
You know,
I'm talking of the evidence that backs the guidelines.
All right.
Those you don't wait till... It's not necessarily going to go into those studies. Those studies will have been conducted 3 months into... 3 months ago to now, to begin to have an idea of how these dynamics will... Well, let me give an example. In Scandinavia...
How do you apply... studies done 3 months ago to a disease?
No, continuous studies.
Okay.
Not that you do it 3 months ago.
Okay.
But 3 months ago to now,
right,
when we had our first infection, we should have started studying this problem. Now we assume we have, because the government spokesperson makes it very clear that they are following these database principles. So you have to assume the studies are being done. My argument is publish them so there's transparency, and the analysts can look at them. If you take Scandinavia, for instance, one of the things that they have to look at very carefully, about 3 things. One was, are young people more likely to be vectors, as in to be super transmitting? They carry the virus, they don't get ill, so they just give it to a lot of people. Is that true or not? And there's been a lot of studies that have now shown that generally they are vectors, but they're not necessarily super transmitting. Do we have that data in Ghana? Can the government spokesperson tell me that they have data about that fact and it has informed the analysis going into this? Probably not. We know, for instance, that therefore in some countries have meant that junior students have been asked to go and senior students have been asked to remain in the home, because they've been informed by the data.
Right.
We know, for instance, that in some countries the determination is that if somebody is found ill, so he talked about the temperature guns. So if you have an index of suspicion, we know your temperature is elevated, and we suspect you are ill, he talks about the quarantine measure. But what if there is a test and the person is detected positive? In most countries that I know, there's a shutdown. And in some countries, when you have had shutdowns in 30% of schools, there is a total shutdown of all schools. So the government sets the benchmark. If there is this number of infections detected in the school, we will close the school. If there is this number of schools where you have infections, we will close all schools in this municipality. Those benchmarks are then guided by data. So the question that I have is that, do we have those benchmarks? And if we have them, why don't you publish them? Yeah. Because they all help with the debate.
But again, are they not able to look at the examples you are using to determine how we should also go about it? So if you look at how China is doing, and they started gradual reopening in March. You have Denmark that opened in April 15. You had Norway, April 20.
I've looked at all those.
Yes.
But I've looked
Singapore,
also at the
among others.
That back those.
And they are very clear about how you go about it. First, there's a health screening, temperature checks, at least twice daily upon arrival in school. You have the quarantine and school closure policies. They quarantine you if you are found to be sick until symptoms have resolved. There's also the group size, and they are looking at group size from between 50 to 30 in some areas.
But you know, in Denmark, they decided that they're going to use primarily outdoor for 55% of activity as much as they can, right?
And like they are seeking to do in Ghana.
It's not just classroom.
And like they are seeking to do in Ghana, meal times, people are to eat at their desks. Unless there's a properly designed, nicely done cafeteria for them to do. And if in Taiwan, if a class is suspended 14 days, if one case is confirmed, and then the whole school is suspended if for 14 days, if you have more than 2 cases.
So all of these are based on analytics designed from a study of the evidence in the literature. So you say that our scientists publish 5 papers, 3 of them suggest that young people are not super transmitting. We think because of that, we're going to do it this way. You say our scientists or our scholars have had these number of papers published. On a meta review, we've concluded that this is the right direction. You state that in the paper, in the white paper, you state that because of this and that, we are inclined to take these measures. And my concern is that we're not seeing those papers. So we're just having to either accept the government's word at face value, or keep whining, as we usually do, and there is no meeting of minds. I'm not here to oppose government measures.
All right.
I'm here to have a reasoned debate as a policy analyst, somebody who was taking a career direction, that I'll spend some of my time analyzing government policy for the benefit of people who don't have the time. Okay. There are people that are too busy to go and read every single government paper, right? My job is to read as many of these papers as possible, so that when I make a comment, I'm making a comment guided by the facts that are there. And my argument is that there isn't sufficient policy transparency. So one, we don't know the studies backing these decisions. And once the decisions have been taken, we don't know the outcomes. Because nobody's publishing the monitoring and evaluation reports. We've had a Ministry of Monitoring and Evaluation. And for the vast number, I would say 99% of major policy decisions, this body, this ministry, has not published regular evaluation results for the public.
Okay.
See, I must quickly say this. That number one, maybe on June 2nd, my friend was not paying attention when the minister in his presentation presented the modeling,
transcripts.
Right? And so you cannot say that just because you didn't pay attention
to the modeling,
the transcript. You reading the transcript is not seeing the modeling.
The minister, but why is the modeling? The modeling should be in the speech or it should be on another paper.
The minister presented the modeling, and just because you have not seen it, I worked on it.
No, he presented it where? Where is the modeling? On your computer?
No, he presented it at Meet the Press and it was shared.
So where is it?
It is shared.
And I said I saw those transcripts and they don't include any model.
You did not see the presentations and the modeling itself.
No. What was shared to the press has been delivered to me.
If you want,
I'll look at it
right now.
But it's not in the public domain.
If you look at it,
so
the modeling was done. That's number one. Number two, you cannot sit there and compare what is happening in Ghana to Norway and other places. We are tired of
194 countries. That's what I said.
Let me.
It's not just Norway.
All of your examples have been Norway, the Scandinavian countries, and all.
I mentioned South Africa.
We also do.
I mentioned Rwanda as well.
Hold on a minute and let me speak.
Okay.
When you were speaking, I didn't interrupt you.
That's fine. Good.
We also do know that when there is good ventilation, that's number one, that the disease doesn't have the same rate of transmission. We know number two, that when the disease or when the virus is exposed to ultraviolet light, which some people made fun of it in the media based on another head of state's comments, that the virus is weakened. So you cannot sit there and look at Norway's modeling and saying they have brought the children outside. Which of our schools have air conditions in the classrooms? We have very high ventilated classrooms. And so those are things that we have looked at. And those are things that we all know based on the data, that based on those things, you can make decisions around real.
I didn't hear him say, if you can't bring the children outside,
no, but what he said,
I'm giving you examples of arguments based on data.
I think we'll do our audience, a good service if we don't pitch this against you have said this or not.
No, but then the truth of the matter is we're here to educate the audience.
He didn't say,
and so we need to be careful.
Okay, he only spoke about the modeling that he hasn't seen, which I haven't seen.
Yes,
I'm just hearing you mention that it has been available.
So ask for it rather than say that I haven't seen it and so.